Well, it was a running story throughout all of last year. Falling revenues made it clear that the budget was dramatically out of balance and that additional cuts were needed. So Governor Paterson called for lawmakers to pass a deficit reduction plan, cutting more than $3 billion out of the budget. But then in November, the legislature approved only some of those cuts, leaving this year's budget hole even deeper. Now, this incident highlighted a fundamental problem in the state's constitution that my next guest says needs to be addressed. Bob Ward is the deputy director of the Rockefeller Institute. He published a study today that looks at this very issue. Thanks for your time, Bob.
My pleasure, Liz.
I have to confess, I was surprised to read this because I always thought, being the daughter of a New York State expert, and we talked about these sort of things at the breakfast table, that the governor of New York was quite powerful inherently.
Yes, well, in some ways he is. And this goes back to the days of Al Smith, who, of course, was a liberal progressive who believed in expanding government so it could serve the people. And he thought that giving the governor the power to control the budget would make sure that the top priorities were addressed. And Franklin Roosevelt and governors ever since then have used those powers. But those powers only relate to origination of the budget and adoption of the budget. They have nothing to do with something that might happen in the middle of the year, as happened last year, as you just said.
Right.
When the revenues drop precipitously, as they did, and spending is going up, in many other states, Maryland, Massachusetts, Oregon, a number of others that we look at in the study, the governor has the power to step in and make mid-year adjustments. Now, in New York, Governor Paterson has that ability, but only in a very limited way. For instance, he cannot touch Medicaid, he can't touch school aid, he can't touch aid to local governments.
Well, he can, but he needs the legislature's approval.
Absolutely.
Right.
And last year we saw that the legislature waited 6 months before taking any action. When they finally did, it was much less than was necessary. And so this fiscal year that we're in now started by rolling over $2 billion of liabilities, effectively the state borrowing from itself.
Right. I actually sort of feel that we almost owe Governor Paterson an apology because when he said, he actually did say this, I don't have the power. In fact, I remember quite clearly in a Wall Street Journal article that he was very frustrated and said, you know, the next governor, whoever comes in, is going to be hamstrung just like I was. And everyone sort of poo-pooed that, saying, well, it's because you can't lead and you've had all these problems and you're a lame duck, etc. But actually, as it turns out, he was right.
That's the case, and he is showing now that there are interesting and effective new ways that he can use his power with relation to the adoption of the budget.
Right.
And he is doing that. But again, if we get to a point later in this current year when the budget develops a big hole in it, he will not have the power to address it in ways that, for instance, Deval Patrick can do in Massachusetts.
Well, which we probably will, because as we've spoken to various leaders, we've found they think that they're going to be able to close this budget without any borrowing, and they're not going to put together these long-term structural reforms that the lieutenant governor has been calling for. And I know borrowing is sort of a bad word. The B word is what the governor calls it. But the problem is that when you don't go to gap budgeting, which is sort of a pay-go, if you will, program, then you really are damning the next person, the next administration, the next round of budgeting to be just as difficult as this one was.
Well, Lieutenant Governor Ravitch has been criticized for advancing the idea of borrowing, but people forget that his proposal included some very strict reforms, not only the gap budgeting that you just mentioned, but also this idea of broadening the governor's authority to deal with unexpected mid-year problems. And what a lot of people don't know is that Speaker Silver has introduced a very similar proposal in the Assembly. So the legislature is demonstrating, I think, that there is some openness to this idea of giving the governor the responsibility and the authority to deal with mid-year problems.
Now, we should say, actually, that if I remember, you should correct me if I'm wrong, if I remember correctly, the lieutenant governor actually raised money to have staff from the Institute actually work for him, and this is part of that effort that he has undertaken.
Yes, absolutely. This is part of the lieutenant governor's project. We are honored to work with him. We have gotten advice from a number of others in the legislature and other sources about this topic. But again, going back to what you said originally, people do view the governor of New York as being strong when it comes to the budgetary powers. And again, that is true at the beginning of the year, but it is not true during the year when these unexpected gaps develop.
Well, isn't the unexpected the key word there? Because when the Constitution was drawn up, I think that the whole point of putting in the April 1st budget deadline was that you were going to get a budget on April 1st, and no one knew that you were going to have these protracted battles, plus that the state would have such an inherent budget deficit structurally going forward.
Well, in these other states, again, Massachusetts, Oregon, and others, they give the governor the power to deal with one year's crisis so that it doesn't roll over into the succeeding years. That is our fundamental problem here in New York. We are perennially, as the saying has been heard lately, kicking the can down the road. Yes. We do it one year after another, and eventually it gets to a point where you have crises such as not opening the state parks, delaying tax refunds, nonprofit groups having to go without paying their workers for certain periods because they're not getting the funding from the state, and many other things like that. So the idea, I think, is to put in some rules that will allow the state to deal effectively with the inevitable budget gaps that arise from time to time.
And what would those be? I mean, really sort of say the top 3 things that could be done. And also, if you need to change the Constitution, it should be said that that's not actually an easy thing to do, but we can get that there in a second. What would be the top 3 things that could be changed that would enable the governor to have more power to deal with these problems?
Well, again, certainly one thing I think is allowing the governor to lead the way in dealing with mid-year gaps by having broader authority to deal with those on his own if the legislature does not.
Without the legislature, right.
A second certainly is establishment of larger budget reserves. And again, these are this is an issue that the lieutenant governor has talked about. Both the Senate and Assembly have looked at it. The issue of, again, that you mentioned, gap budgeting, stricter budgeting rules, so that it's more difficult for the state to incur a liability this year and say, well, I'm not going to pay for it until next year or the year after.
That's like pushing your bills. That's bill management, sort of, for people who don't. It sounds fancy, but it's basically saying, well, I've got this bill and I'll pay it next month, and then I'll pay this other bill next month.
It's like saying, you know, I'm going to pay my June mortgage bill in October.
Right, when you get a penalty for that, actually, in the real world.
You get a penalty, and in the meantime, you have other mortgage payments to make. So you have to deal with these as they come along.
Shelley Silver has a bill, you say, too. What's going on in the Senate? Is there a same-as companion bill there, or no?
No, the Senate has its own fiscal reform package that does include the gap budgeting, but they have not embraced this issue of dealing with mid-year gaps. Some of the leaders there, Senator Krueger, for instance, has said that they are open to looking at the lieutenant governors and the Assembly proposals. So I think one of the interesting things, Liz, in these final weeks, if the budget is actually going to be finalized now, one of the interesting questions will be, do they do any of these fiscal reforms that might make future crises less likely?
Now, this is actually a really, I mean, we don't have time to get into this in depth, but where could people find this if they wanted to do a little white paper reading?
They could find it at rockinst.org, ROCKINST.org, or they can Google Rockefeller Institute.
And it's actually right there, because that's where I found it. It's right on the homepage there, so, and it's in a PDF form, very handy for reading. I want to thank you very much for coming in and talking to us, Bob Ward. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.